Hey guys, Art Decline here, Average Picker. So, I'm still working actually and been poking at this challenge lock from Covert Medical. And in the past, I had done a video with just some kind of advice for people getting started. And I talked about how it doesn't matter if you don't get the lock open, as long as you're kind of progressing and learning something. And I talked about how kind of over time, as you work on a lock and stuff, you start to kind of develop a mental picture of what's happening in that lock. So I decided I would make this video an attempt to document my own, thinking process when I'm working on something. And one reason is this challenge lock from Covert Medical ET. It's just what I would describe as a good, clean, consistent lock. It doesn't feel like there's anything too crazy going on in there. It's well put together. It's just very clean and consistent. And so I tend to pick in like kind of bursts. I don't sit down and do really long sessions, but I do probably in total have over an hour put into this lock now, if not two. And I mean, some of that has just been, feeling around with the pick and lifting, applying different amounts of tension to the left and right. So I thought it might be interesting and maybe slightly beneficial that I attempt to translate what is in my mind about what's happening in this lock into put it down on paper and to some kind of logical method thing. This isn't something I do though, and so this is kind of a first attempt at that. Normally I kind of think, oh, this is the mushy pin, oh, that's the kind of spirited one. I tend to think in kind of abstract terms. So I'm going to attempt to translate that into something and show you what I'm thinking about this particular lock, and how just kind of that mental image starts to form in your mind about what could potentially be going on. For all I know, I am completely wrong. But regardless, I think it would be interesting to have a documentation of that and of that process. And maybe somewhere along the way, it'll be useful, especially to you guys starting out, to kind of see what you can learn by not getting a lock open. So with that said, let's get to look at this. Okay, so if we look at the binding order, I started kind of trying to map out a couple of the binding orders I had touched on in playing around with this. So if we're picking the lock clockwise, 2 immediately feels like a binder. As soon as you slide the pick in, it feels like it wants to bind. The next, if we push just past that, is 3. 3 seems to want to bind. So if we do a 2-3 pick on it, then all of a sudden we just get a lot of mushy lifts. They don't feel very clean, and nothing really feels like it's setting, or if something does set, when we move on, we start dropping pins. So I would consider that a dead end. So what if we back the pick out 1? So we pick 2 because we know it's binding, it feels really good. And we back it out to 1. Okay, well 1 wants to set, but then once again we run into a dead end where pins start feeling mushy or things don't want to set, things like that. Okay, so what if we try checking 3 first? Let's get up under 2, because we know 3 feels like a binder when we do 2. But what if we get up under 2 and we go straight to 3? Well then, yeah, we find that 3 is binding, and it wants to. So we back it out, and let's check pin 2, because we've had pin 2 wanting to be the obvious binding pin. And there it is. 2 is definitely wanting to be picked. Push on into the lock, and we hit number 4. And then, so it looks like pretty easy. The lock should be open at this point. We're only left with 1 or 5 that would seem to need to be picked at this point. However, that turns out not to be the case. So this could be leading us into another dead end, or because we've closed in on 3 of the 5 pins, it could be that something is going on when I'm moving past pin 4 to hit 5 and I'm lifting. I may be snagging pin 4, right? And we're going to look at why that's the case. And so what may be happening is I'm actually pin 5 does want to maybe bind, but I'm actually at the same time I'm pushing pin 4 up too much. And it's causing this to not work for me, okay? Okay, so in the previous video where I had worked on picking this lock, I mentioned that earlier I had gotten what I would describe as a false set from the lock, a very, very, very shallow false set. Well, what started to occur to me was that false set was probably too shallow to actually be what we would associate a false set being with spool pins. And if we start looking at what happens when we're picking on these pins, so if we look at 3 produces 2 clicks typically, or one really solid one. Now when I say it produces 2 clicks, these are not sharp clicks. One is kind of a very dull, subdued click, but if we get just a good solid lift on it, we get one really good just snap with it. So that kind of suggests that there may be shallow cuts on the, let's call it spool-like elements to the pin 3, right? If we look at number 2, it does the same thing. We get kind of a 2 or 3 clicks, but they're not always that great. They're a little bit similar. They're kind of mushy feeling. So again, that kind of tells us that we may have spool-ish elements. We're not getting a deep false set, so nothing's too cut, but we may have shallow cuts on that pin. Number 1, time I wrote this, I wasn't real sure. 5, when I wrote this down, I was convinced was a standard. I'm not so sure now. I actually worked on this lock a little bit this morning, and I think we've got probably one little cut in it. So how would we explain the false set, or the shallow false set that we were getting? Well, if enough of these pins do have very shallow cuts that are not serrations, and by serrations I mean you just got them piled on each other very close together, almost like a screw, we would get more of a crunchy click, 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 click kind of feel out of it, and that's not what we're getting. We're getting just a few, and they seem to be in very precise places. But we're not getting a spool feel from it. Well, so what could be happening that explains this false set is if we're putting enough of these into those cuts on the pin, it would allow the core to rotate just ever so slightly for however deep the shallowest of these spool-ish elements are. So if we go based on this feedback, and let's say we do not know where the shear lines are. So what we're going to do is we're going to treat each pin stack, so that's the driver and the key pin, as just one big giant pin, okay? And by poking in, and in some cases using no tension at all, we don't even have a tension wrench in the lock, I'm just pushing the pin maybe at a little bit of an angle and lifting it, and I'm intentionally overlifting. And sometimes it's just applying various degrees of tension, maybe going left and going right, and doing the same thing, just slowly moving each pin up as much as I can. That helped us kind of get these distinguishing marks between mushy spool-like elements, kind of, and serrations and things like that. But we can kind of draw them out as one big pin and say, okay, we're assuming pin stack 1, has 2 cutaways on it, has 2 cuts on it, right? So it's beveled in 2 places. Pin stack 2 seems to have 4. Pin stack 3 seems to have 2, so 3 seems very similar to number 1. And yesterday I was operating off of the aspect that 5 was a standard, but today I got back in there with one of the SS Dev picks and started pushing on it. And I'm going to say that pin 4 and 5 actually also have at least 1 cutaway on them in some capacity. So that's something I just figured out this morning. If we look at the feedback we were getting from our lifts, we also end up with this. So pin 3 seems to produce our highest lift, right? So this is the pin that I've got to go kind of the most up at an angle with the pick. 4 is the lowest. 4 just needs a nudge. So that kind of tells us 4 may be only cut, to the most shallow depth on the key. But it really just needs a slight nudge. And it feels like it's set, okay? And then I've got 1, 2, and 5 is labeled normal. And by normal, I mean something between this lowest and this highest, and something that in general in picking is not producing a weird movement on the pick. It is just what you would maybe associate with just saying, hey, that's just a normal picking action, right? Which if you've picked a lock or two, you're familiar with. Sometimes you end up with really strange maneuvers you're trying to do, where maybe you're trying to lift multiple pins across there or something like that, or you're going really steep. No, by normal I just mean just what you'd expect. So if we take this though, we can break these down, because we don't say, like I said, this represents it is one big pin, but we know this is actually a pin stack made up of a driver and a key pin. So we can break it down and look at what our various combinations could be. So if this down here, these are the key pins, right? And these up here are the drivers, okay? Well, both of those cuts could be on the driver and nothing on the key pin, or it could share them 1 and 1. Now, of course, we could have both cuts on the key pin. However, I did not draw that one because I've already noted that pin 1 is a normal lift. There's nothing weird feeling about it. So if both of these cuts were actually on the key pin, for me to have detected that, I would have had to have really pushed that pin pretty far up there, way into an overlift to detect it. So these are our kind of safe combinations for what we can figure 1 and 3 are. So if we look at 2, okay, 2 feels like somewhere in that stack there's 4 spool-like elements to it. And that gives us a whole varying thing of combinations. All 4 could be on here. So all 4 could be on the driver. Could have 3 on the driver, 2 on the driver, or 1 on the driver. Now we can probably dismiss this, because that would mean that this was having to sit really, really low in the core, right? In order for us to be able to feel it up that high, this would have to be pretty deep. Having 3 and 1, given that the lift is a normal lift, feels like the best combination. Though it would be possible, maybe, depending on the length of these, to have it be 2 and 2. 1 and 4, again, is going to be way out, because we've noted that pin 2 lifts feeling like normal. And if it feels like normal, to get all 3 of these cuts on one pin, and it's the same with this, to get all 4 of these cuts on one pin would just require a rather odd length pin, or a very huge kind of reach on it. Because again, we're not talking about serrations where they're piled on each other. We are talking about something much more subtle. Let me see if I happen to have just a pin laying around. Yeah, let's just use this. We're talking about something much more subtle. Like almost like just part of this. So it'd be really difficult to place, 4 of those all along one pin. So anyway, yeah. So that's kind of what we're looking at right now as I feel my way through this thing, and just kind of the mental images that's come up. I'm still convinced I don't think there's anything crazy going on in the core. I don't think it's, like I said, the lock feels very clean and consistent. So I don't think there's any kind of crazy undercuts going or anything like that. But there does seem to be some modification to the core made. And I don't know, when we open it, I'm not going to be too surprised to find if the holes are slightly elongated on one side maybe than another, just to kind of help those not bind. depending on which direction you're picking it. But I stopped kind of exploring this, and I decided to kind of focus on that. So anyway, that'll wrap up this video. Hopefully though, especially if you're a new picker, this kind of helps you get an idea of the mental image that starts to form in your mind and things you can learn from a particular lock, even if you're not getting it successfully open. Like I said, it doesn't matter if you don't open it. You can always try again. But you always want to be progressing and learning something. And I'm not saying spell this out like this. I've never done this before. I will probably never do this again. It's kind of a pain. But yeah, you will start to get an image in your head. And it'll kind of hopefully start to run something semi-logical like that. And the more clear that becomes, the easier and easier the lock gets, and eventually, with any luck, we should have it open. All right, guys. Hope you've enjoyed. I will talk to you later. Hopefully, I've got a package coming in today that I ordered, so we might have some cheap pick review coming up. I'm not sure. We'll see what happens. All right, guys. Bye.